The courtroom was eerily silent, except for the faint scratching of pens and the occasional cough. Judge Randall Wilkins, a stout man with a sharp tongue and a habit of belittling those before him, leaned back in his chair. Peering over his glasses, he directed his gaze at the frail-looking elderly black woman standing in the center of the room. Her hands trembled slightly, her silver-gray hair neatly pinned into a bun. She wore a simple brown dress, complemented by a modest pearl necklace. With a scoff, the judge let out a chuckle, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ma'am," he said, shaking his head, "you're representing yourself? This is a court of law, not some neighborhood gathering. You do realize that, don't you?" A few snickers rippled through the room. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor, a young man in an expensive suit, smirked, as if the case was already won. But the elderly woman remained silent, her lips pressing into a thin line as she studied the judge with an unyielding stare. Judge Wilkins flipped through the file in front of him, barely glancing at her. "Let me guess, you've watched a few courtroom dramas and figured, why not play lawyer for the day? Ma'am, I strongly advise you to reconsider. This case is serious business, and I don't have time for." Then it happened. The woman reached into her purse, pulled out a dusty leather folder, and slid it across the table toward the bailiff. He hesitated, then picked it up and flipped it open. Within seconds, his eyes widened in shock. Quickly, he handed it to the judge. As Judge Wilkins read the name on the documents, the color drained from his face. His smirk disappeared. His hands, once steady, now trembled as he flipped through the pages again. His mouth opened, then closed, as if he was struggling for words. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. A court clerk nearly dropped her coffee. Even the prosecutor's smirk had vanished, replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. The elderly woman tilted her head, her voice suddenly sharp as a blade. "Now, Judge Wilkins," she said, each word cutting through the stunned silence, "would you like to continue mocking me? Or would you prefer to show some respect to a former Supreme Court attorney?" The courtroom fell into an electrified hush. Hours earlier, the sun had just begun to rise as Eleanor Jackson stepped out of her modest home, gripping the handle of her worn leather briefcase. She inhaled deeply, taking in the crisp morning air, then set off toward the courthouse at a steady pace. Eleanor had spent decades inside courtrooms. But today was different. Today, she wasn't entering as a defender of justice, she was walking in as a defendant. She had never imagined this day would come. A month ago, a legal notice had arrived, one that shook her to her core. She was being sued. A wealthy real estate developer, Charles Duval, had accused her of fraud in a decades-old property dispute case. According to the lawsuit, she had tampered with evidence, an outrageous lie. Eleanor had spent her life fighting for justice, and now she was being accused of corruption. For weeks, she had pored over every document, revisited every legal precedent she could find. She had reached out to old colleagues for help, but none were willing to take the case pro bono. And at her age, hiring an elite attorney was out of the question. She had only one option. She would defend herself. As she entered the courthouse, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. She had walked these halls countless times before, but today, everything felt different. The people who once greeted her with respect barely gave her a glance. To them, she was just another elderly woman, someone past her prime, someone who should be at home knitting instead of standing trial. She arrived early, quietly taking her seat at the defendant's table. Across the room, Charles Duval lounged confidently with his team of high-priced lawyers. He smirked as he whispered something to his attorney. He was a man used to winning. When Judge Wilkins finally entered, Eleanor drew in a slow breath. She had faced powerful opponents before, ruthless attorneys, high-stakes trials. But this was different. This time, her own reputation, her very legacy was on the line. Judge Wilkins shuffled through his papers, barely looking at her. "I assume you're here to request a public defender, ma'am," he said with an air of boredom. Eleanor simply folded her hands. "No, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." Soft chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The judge sighed dramatically. "Ma'am, do you have any legal experience at all?" This time, Eleanor didn't answer right away. She let the silence hang, just long enough for the judge's impatience to grow. Then at last she said, "A little." The judge smirked, shaking his head. "Well, this should be interesting." From the prosecution's table, Thomas Barrett, Duval's lead attorney, stood up. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to make a motion to dismiss the defense's ability to represent herself. Clearly, this woman is not qualified to handle a case of this magnitude." Judge Wilkins nodded. "Frankly, I agree. Miss Jackson, this is your last chance. I strongly suggest hiring professional legal counsel." That was when Eleanor reached into her purse. That was the moment everything changed. The truth revealed. The courtroom had been laughing at Eleanor Jackson just moments ago, treating her like a lost old woman who had wandered in by mistake.
Now,
Judge Wilkins sat stiffly in his chair, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The prosecutor had lost his arrogant smirk, instead flipping through his notes with a frantic energy, as if trying to salvage control. But it was too late. Eleanor remained calm. She had been in courtrooms like this 1,000 times before. But today it was personal. Barrett cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "Your Honor, while the defense may have a legal background, that does not change the fact that she has been accused of serious misconduct." Eleanor didn't flinch. She expected this, a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. Barrett pressed on. "The plaintiff, Mr. Charles Duval, has submitted evidence suggesting that Miss Jackson tampered with official property records 30 years ago, resulting in an unjust ruling in favor of her client. We believe this constitutes fraud and seek full restitution." Judge Wilkins nodded. "Miss Jackson, do you wish to respond before we proceed?" Eleanor slowly stood. Her body was aged, yes, but her presence commanded the room. "I do, Your Honor," she said, then turned to Barrett. "Mr. Barrett, you claim I tampered with property records. Have you personally examined these so-called falsified documents?" Barrett hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "The evidence." "That wasn't my question," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady. "I asked if you had seen them yourself." Barrett exhaled sharply. "No, but my client." Eleanor said, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Your client, Charles Duval, the same man who has built an empire off stealing land from the poor and calling it urban development?" Duval shot up from his seat. "That's outrageous," he shouted. "Your Honor, I object to this baseless attack on my character." Eleanor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am simply pointing out Mr. Duval's well-documented history. Or shall I submit articles and court records detailing his previous lawsuits for fraud, land misappropriation, and illegal evictions?" The courtroom murmured, people shifting in their seats. Judge Wilkins sighed. "Miss Jackson, please keep your statements relevant to this case." Eleanor nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." She walked over to the evidence table. "Then let's talk about this case." And that's when she exposed the biggest lie of all.